Hey everybody, this is Chet and welcome to my first Patreon tutorial, Oil Painting Basics. For this first tutorial, I'm going to discuss the tools and basic techniques I use to create an oil painting. I'm going to cover brushes, paints, mediums, painting surfaces, painting palettes, and I'm also going to give a brief overview of how I start an oil painting. Now, if you don't have a lot of experience painting in oils, this is a pretty good place to start. Brushes. Brushes are really important when painting in oils. You want brushes that will last a long time and that will do what you want them to do. So it's best to stay away from the super cheap discount brushes you could get at Michael's and other craft stores. When it comes to brushes, you really kind of get what you pay for. So if your budget is an issue, invest in good brushes and just take care of them. They will perform better and they will last a lot longer than the cheap brushes. Personally, I use Trekell brushes, but any name brand paintbrush will probably do the job. Now, there are many different types of brushes, but the two I'm going to focus on primarily are the stiff hog bristle brushes and the soft brushes such as sables or golden taklons. Hog bristle brushes are particularly suited to painting in oils because of the stiffness. The stiffness allows you to hold more paint on your brush, and that's really important, especially when you are at the blocking in stage of your painting. For detail work and glazing, I like to use soft brushes such as the golden taklons or sables from Trekell. The main brush types I use are filberts, flats, rounds, and liners. There are also other types like brights, which are basically flats but with shorter bristles, eggberts, which are like filberts but really long, fan brushes, mops. There's all kinds of different types of brushes. But for the most part, I get what I need from flats and rounds and liners. I also use filbert, sable, or golden taklon soft brushes for glazing. I used to exclusively use hog bristle filberts for years and years, but for some reason I started using flats, and I really like the feel of them. It's really more of a feel thing, but you can get different effects from the different types of brushes. Filberts are like a wide brush that have a curved and kind of rounded top painting edge, which tends to give you a softer brush stroke. The filberts are probably the best all-purpose brush. They're good for blocking in paintings by using the flat side, the wide side, but you can also do some broader line work by using the tip of the brush. Flats are like filberts, except that they are flat and blunt across the top edge. They tend to give you a harder edge brush stroke. They're great for blocking in big shapes, and if you turn the brush sideways, you can also get sharp edges with them. So rounds, unlike filberts and flats, are round and they come to a point at the tip. I like to use the smaller rounds for detail work. And then liners are like rounds, but they're longer and thinner. So like the name suggests, they're great for detail and line work. Mediums. A medium is a material that can be added to your paint to change the properties of it in some way. I usually only mix two things into my paints during the painting process: odorless mineral spirits and liquid. Now, the odorless mineral spirits is basically a replacement for turpentine, and that thins the oil paint out. And I only really use this during the underpainting stage and to clean paint out of my brushes. The odorless mineral spirits that I use is called Gamsol, and it's by the company Gamblin. I use it because it is supposed to be the safest of all the odorless mineral spirits. So there's lots of different oil painting mediums. There's linseed oil, which is like the most common, Damar varnish, Galkid, Neo McGilp, wax medium, copal medium, and on and on and on. I've experimented with quite a few, but the one that I like the best is liquid. It's like liquid, but with an N, Liquin, and that's by Winsor and Newton. It's a synthetic alkyd medium. It gives the paint a silky kind of consistency, and it speeds drying time, so my layers will dry overnight, which is really important to the way I work. And it works really good for creating transparent glazes as well. Mediums are used for a lot of different reasons: to increase the flow of your paint, to create glazes, to speed or slow the drying time, or even to give your paint more body to create texture effects. I think a lot of people that are new to oil painting often get tripped up in the beginning because they try painting with straight oil paints and no medium, which is not a really easy way to paint in oils. It can be done, but I wouldn't recommend it to somebody who's just starting to learn how to paint in oils. Paints. Oil paints usually consist of only 2 or 3 ingredients: a pigment, often in the form of powder, a binder, usually linseed oil, and sometimes a thinner like turpentine. Now, different colors have different properties and different drying times, which is another reason that using a medium like Liquin is helpful, because it makes all of your paints dry in the same way and mostly within the same time frame. Some colors, like the umbers, are known as dryers themselves, while colors like titanium white and the cadmium colors take a long time to dry on their own. It's a good time to note that there are oil paints with dryers already in them called alkyds, but they're more expensive and not as widely used. One good trick is to replace your titanium white with an alkyd white, which is also known as underpainting white or quick dry white. Since white is the most widely used paint on your palette and you tend to mix it into every other color, it will serve as a dryer for your paints. You can also use traditional mediums with alkyd paints. It's not necessary to use this technique, it's just a little tip. Also, since white is so widely used, it's good to get larger tubes of white when you buy your paints. It's really rare to use a color straight out of a tube onto your painting because pre-made colors are created with a maximum amount of chroma or color saturation. See, it's easy to gray down a color that is high in chroma, but it's impossible to add chroma to an already gray color. So the bright colors that come pre-mixed in a tube are made to give you the widest variety of colors. This is why color mixing is so important, and it'll be something we'll cover in a future tutorial. But anyway, that's the reason you shouldn't generally be using store-bought colors straight from the tube. For example, if you were to take a phthalo green or a phthalo blue or something like that and painted it straight on the canvas without graying it down, it just wouldn't look natural. It would look too bright and too saturated with color. Another thing I wanted to mention about oil colors is that they all have different opacity levels. Transparent, like alizarin crimson, semi-transparent, like yellow ochre, or totally opaque, like Venetian red. It's sometimes indicated on the back of the tube by having the words transparent, semi-transparent, or opaque, as in the case of the Gamblin oil colors, or by little icons, like a clear square means transparent, a square with a line through it, or a half black and half white square means semi-opaque, and a fully black square means fully opaque. While this doesn't necessarily apply to this tutorial, it is good to know for future use. For transparent glazes, you'd want to use a transparent paint. For covering something up or anytime you want a really opaque paint, you'd use opaque. For doing something like a scumble, you would use a semi-transparent paint. Now, scumbling is basically taking a semi-transparent paint and scrubbing it over something that's already been painted. It gives an interesting veiling type of effect, and it's really useful. Anyway, we will be covering those techniques in a future tutorial. A couple of final words about oil paints. Although we're only using 3 colors for this simple demonstration today, a good beginner's paint palette would be titanium white, yellow ochre, cadmium red light, a blue like French ultramarine blue, an umber like a burnt umber or a raw umber, and ivory black. Also, when you purchase your paints, try and get the professional grade colors rather than the student grade colors. I know it's more expensive, but the professional grade colors just have a much larger pigment load. Paint palettes. So the paint palette is where you place your tube colors, usually around the edge or off to one side, and where you mix them, usually in the center of the palette. There are a few types of paint palettes to choose from. There's that classic wood palette that you hold with your non-painting hand. They have paper pad versions of those, which makes it, kind of easier because you don't have to clean your palette every day. You can just rip a page of the pad off when you're done, but you kind of waste a lot of paint that way. There's the glass palette that you can put next to you on a table. It's nice because you can scrape the paint off when you're done with a razor blade. That's what I used for years, until I found the parallel palette. The parallel palette was invented by a really great artist named David Casson. It attaches to a regular camera tripod and basically turns straight up and down on the same parallel axis as your easel. It's very useful because you can put your palette right next to your easel and sort of check colors as you're mixing them. It's also good because you're using less shoulder movement to get from the palette to your painting, which can really be an issue if you're painting a lot. It has cup holders to hold your mediums. It's also small enough to fit in a backpack, and it comes with a plastic cover so you can cover it up and throw it in your backpack if you have to travel with your paints. I use it whenever I do a convention where I'm going to be live painting, but it works so well I use it every day in my studio. A palette will often have a clip-on metal cup or something to hold your painting medium. If you don't have a little cup that clips on for your medium, you can always just dump some off to the side on your palette by your oil paints, especially if you have a thicker medium like liquid, which is kind of gelatinous. It'll just sit in a pile. Now, the way you lay your colors out on the palette doesn't really matter. I have mine basically with warm colors in one strip going from light to dark, and cool colors on another strip, basically going from cool to warm. There's not a right or a wrong way to lay out a palette. There's only a way that makes sense to you. The important thing about laying your colors out in a palette is that you stick to it once you get a system that you like. You should know where every color on your palette is by memory so that when you go to get your color, it's just second nature and you don't really have to think about it. This is especially important when you have a lot of colors on your palette. Sometimes the darker transparent colors like Prussian blue or dioxazine purple look exactly the same at first glance. Painting's already hard enough without having to stop what you're doing and then figure out which color is which, so just find a layout that works for you and stick to it. One often overlooked tool is the palette knife. It really works perfectly for scooping up paint and mixing it on your palette. You can use a brush to do this, but it tends to be more messy. You get paint up in the base of your brush that's hard to get out sometimes. And the other cool thing about using a palette knife is that it kind of forces you to use a little more paint than you normally would, and you should never cheap out on how much paint you're using when you're making a painting. You want more than enough paint there, and you also don't want to have to keep remixing all of your colors. Surfaces. For most of my painting career, I've painted on pre-gessoed cotton stretched canvas. It's inexpensive, lightweight, and convenient. It's always in stock at the art store because it's so widely used. Gesso is a chalky acrylic canvas primer, and without it, a raw canvas will suck the oil out of oil paint and make it really difficult to paint. You can get oil primed canvas or linen. I prefer oil primed just because the feel of the paint going on top of the oil prime feels better to me, but you know, it's more expensive too. So acrylic primed canvases are fine. I've probably used that, you know, more than oil primed. You can gesso the surface of a canvas yourself, but it's kind of, you know, another step to do and sort of a hassle. I'll cover that probably in a pro tip in the future, gessoing. The other surface I've used a lot is Gesso Board by Ampersand. Gesso Board's a pre-gessoed, acid-free masonite type of panel. It's very smooth and great for doing tightly rendered paintings. I usually paint my 5x7 studies on these. What I'm really into these days is what they're calling ACM panel. ACM stands for aluminum composite material, and it's two thin aluminum panels bonded together by a non-aluminum substrate in between. It's basically the same stuff that street signs are made out of. And street signs have to go through hell being in all kinds of weather conditions, and they have to last forever. So it's super strong, super lightweight too, and really durable. But it's, you know, it's expensive. It's pretty pricey. You can get it primed or unprimed. I got the stuff I got when I started painting on it got it primed, and it did have a bit of a texture to it, like it was rolled on with a paint roller, so I had to go in with a little sandpaper and sand it down a bit. Painting. Like I said before, there are many different ways to paint, and this is just the way that I do it. I would encourage you all to learn as many different ways of painting as you possibly can, because it will only make you a better painter. Don't get hung up on only painting everything one way. Now here's a quick rundown of the process. I first tone my painting surface with a fairly neutral tone like raw umber mixed with a little bit of mineral spirits. Now I tone the canvas so that I'm not painting on stark white, which kind of messes with my perception of values because bright white is so stark. It also lays in a middle tone value for the whole painting, which is kind of convenient because then I just need to kind of focus on the shadows and highlights because the middle range value is already there. Then I take the raw umber and I outline my figure in the painting. I then block in the forms with the raw umber. When I get that to a place where it's looking good, I let it dry overnight, and then I quickly block in the mid-range values, the shadow values, and the highlight values. Now, those of you who aren't familiar with the term values, very simply put, it's just the levels of light and dark that's in a painting. I then go in and start modeling the forms and refine the painting until it starts looking good. This is basically a variation of a technique my dad used to use for his paintings. I've read about it in books, and I just kind of arrived at my own version of it through experimentation. For me, it's always felt like the most natural way to paint. So anyway, I put some paint onto the palette, dip my brush in a little bit of odorless mineral spirits, mix it in, and make a thin wash, and quickly coat my painting surface using a flat or filbert bristle brush. The layer should be pretty thin, but not too thin. It's kind of a feel thing to get the mixture right. Too much mineral spirits and it will be too runny and it'll take a long time to dry and it'll be too slick and kind of screw you up. Too little, the paint won't dry as fast and it'll be too dark. So you just have to get a feel for it. Once I have an even layer of paint on the surface, I go in and start sketching the painting in, starting with the outline of the character at first and then going in and blocking in the large shadow areas, still using the raw umber mixture. At this point, I start paying attention to the values, and I really treat it like a drawing. I'm still using only mineral spirits as my medium, no liquid yet. I'm using barely any mineral spirits at this stage. For darker shadows, I use even less. Too much and you won't be able to get the darks that you want. To bring up the lights, I'll use a rag or a paper towel to wipe the paint off. It's like painting in reverse or erasing from a drawing. As I work this, the mineral spirits has begun to evaporate and the paint gets easier to work with as you go. If it's a big runny mess, then you probably use too much mineral spirits. One of the cool things about toning your painting surface and painting your underpainting in a specific color is that those tones will kind of bleed through on areas where you aren't painting as opaquely, like shadow areas that you want to keep more transparent. So if you have a painting you know you want warm shadows all over the whole thing, you can paint a warm underpainting, and then when you're painting your opaques in, you kind of leave the shadow areas a little transparent, like you can paint in there, but that warm underpainting is still going to show through. So you can paint straight into a wet underpainting. I usually like to let mine dry overnight if I have the luxury of time to do that. I like that it's just fixed and I can't mess it up when I go in to paint my next layer. So with this demo, I let that underpainting dry overnight. So the next day, I get a little of my underpainting color and I mix in a little bit of liquid and I paint that all over the surface very lightly and very transparently. I like painting into a wet surface, and the little bit of color I mix in with the liquid also serves to help unify the color when I'm painting on the surface, and a little bit of that raw umber will kind of mix into every color I'm using, which will help unify everything. So it's like a little added bonus. Next, I mix a series of values from my darkest shadow color to my lightest highlight color. I'm using burnt sienna and white as my mid-range value color, and a little more white for my highlight color, and burnt umber and burnt sienna for my shadow color. It's super basic, but I wanted to keep this aspect of the tutorial very simple and easy to follow. Once I have the colors mixed, I use a hog bristle brush, just a bit larger than I feel like I need. This forces me to focus on the bigger shapes and keeps me from going into detail too early, and also helps me paint the block in faster. I start by dipping my brush into the liquid, just a little teeny bit, and mix it into the middle value color. I then go in and quickly block color into the middle value areas. I'm also painting over my middle range tone in the highlight areas, because when I go back with the highlights, I like to paint into the mid-range values. So I'm basically just painting everywhere except the shadow areas using the mid-range color. Then I do the same process, but using the darker value color and block in the shadows, taking a little bit of care to keep the deepest shadows kind of translucent. As a general rule of thumb, shadows should use a more transparent paint, and the areas where light is hitting the subject should be more opaque, with the highlights being the most opaque. This isn't true for every painting, but it's what I usually do when I make my paintings. And I think it looks pretty good. the final step of the initial block-in stage, I begin to add my highlight color on what would be the high points of the forms. I do this by painting directly into my middle value color, but in the areas where it would be appropriate to put highlights. This begins to round the forms and develop the shapes. Here I'm going back in and restating my highlight colors because I blended them in a bit too much. Once the basic paint sections are laid in, I can then do some modeling of the forms and bring back the middle value color, the shadow color, the highlight, and alternate between those different values just to get things looking good. It gets a little more fun at this stage once the basic block in is done. In future sessions, when the layers are dry, I might do some transparent glazing to further refine the colors or punch up some colors or tone down some other colors. But that's for a future tutorial. Now notice at this point I have switched to a smaller flat bristle brush. I do this because I want to start adding some more refined detail. Now this is not really a detail pass per se, but it is just the next level of refining the painting. Now during this process of modeling the forms, I'm also blending the colors together a bit and some of the transitions together. I don't want to blend every single brush stroke, but I want to analyze and choose wisely which areas should be blended. So I'm not going to finish this painting much more than this. It was basically just to give you an idea of how I start a painting generally. Aside from some of the more advanced techniques like glazing and scumbling and detail work, this is really about 90% of the process. It's really pretty simple when you think about it. There's not a ton of steps, and it's really more about creating a good drawing with your paint and modeling the forms properly and knowing what looks correct in a painting. Now, as I mentioned before, the future tutorials will be covering the next level of techniques, and I look forward to creating those for you. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I had fun creating it, and I will speak to you next time. All right, goodbye.